What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Alright, so Secret Invasion is one of those really weird events in Marvel Comics. It actually turns out to be really cool. But in truth, Secret Invasion was really like a linchpin story. And what I mean by that is a lot of things were tied into it. I mean, it was really the foundation for a lot of stuff. Because when Marvel wrote Civil War, it was in the midst of this kind of like rebranding. Not like, the heroic age rebranding, but the rebranding in the sense that Marvel wanted to ensure that their readers had confidence that they could continue to create compelling stories. Plus, it was the idea that coming out of the, the near comic bust of the industry, Marvel kind of had to just like set the world on fire for a few years in order to get people to realize that they were still capable of crafting great stories. And so it was kind of like an all hands on deck thing. So I mean, we had, Brian Michael Bendis and a multitude of other writers. J. Michael Straczynski and Thor was a really good example that comes to mind. It was all about crafting stories that would resonate with people in a way where it would take things in a direction they didn't really expect. The problem with this is that Civil War was a story where it was this idea that the superhuman landscape had been changed forever. I mean, the introduction of the Superhuman Registration Act, the issue that Marvel was facing is the Registration Act has to end somehow. And it only ends one of two ways. Either it ends because it ends organically, which is actually what we kind of saw here, or I guess really with Siege and Dark Reign is really where we saw that, or Marvel simply just ends it. The problem with Marvel just ending it is after all the arrests and all the, heinous conditions in Prison 42 and all the stuff that we saw in Civil War, if Marvel suddenly came along with a story where the government's like, you know what, the Superhuman Registration Act's not fair, let's just end it, it would have seemed ad hoc. And people would have just been like, well, this is ridiculous. Instead, Marvel had to basically kind of engineer its elimination, and Secret Invasion was the first step to doing that. Now, the cool thing about this is that Secret Invasion really has its roots in Brian Michael Bendis' run of the New Avengers, or not really New Avengers, but like the Illuminati's introduction. And what Bendis basically said here was that at one point in the history of the Marvel Universe, the Kree and the Skrull had basically waged war against one another. Now, I have a whole video on why it is they waged war against one another. The idea was that along the way, the Illuminati on Earth had basically gone to meet with the Skrulls. And the reason why is because the Kree-Skrull war had almost impacted Earth. And the Illuminati of Black Bolt and Name of the Submariner and Doctor Strange, Reed Richards, all these guys, they basically all gone to the Skrulls and said, if you ever come close to Earth, if you ever do anything that will cause problems on Earth, we will come back and we will obliterate your planet. In return, the Skrulls kidnapped the Illuminati and just studied them for a while and then released them, which in the eyes of the Illuminati was, almost in the blink of an eye. But for the Skrulls, they had basically gone through, analyzed the human DNA, copied them, and so on and so forth. Now, while this was going on, there was a princess of the Skrull Empire named Princess Varanki, I think it was. And she had basically popped up one day and said, hey guys, there's going to be a prophecy, or there is a prophecy, where the Skrull Empire will be destroyed, and when that day comes, we need to have a place to go to. Ultimately, she was basically arrested and cast out for heresy, but then Galactus destroyed the Skrull homeworld. And so because of this, she was more or less proven correct, and in what was left of the tattered remnants of the Skrull Empire, those who realized the truth of her words basically rallied around her. And so what she did, along with a handful of other Skrull members, is they used the research they had regarding the Illuminati. They kidnapped a whole bunch of heroes before the events of House of M, and then they started replacing heroes before House of M. And so between the events of House of M and Civil War leading up to Secret Invasion, there were a whole bunch of heroes who were being replaced by Skrull replicants in addition to, normal members of society. Now, no one knew about this, but it was a way for Marvel to come back and say, remember how those characters were acting like out of character? Remember how, Tony Stark was acting out of character, and, Carol Danvers was acting out of character, and so on and so forth, and Reed was being weird? Well, that's because they were Skrulls. They weren't really the superheroes that we knew. Now, in truth, when it was originally announced, it seemed like kind of a lame excuse, but the story was anything but. And what happened here is that as part of the prelude to Secret Invasion, the Queen Varanki had basically, shown up on Earth, disguised as Spider-Woman Jessica Drew, and on a mission with the New Avengers to basically infiltrate the Hands organization and retrieve a superhero that had been taken prisoner. I want to say her name was Maya, was successfully rescued, but Elektra was killed in the process. However, Elektra reverted to a Skrull form. And so what happened was Spider-Woman Jessica Drew, along with a handful of other heroes, were talking about what to do. And Jessica Drew said, well, let's take Elektra to Tony Stark and see what he says, and we can figure out if he's a Skrull or not, because at that point the question was being asked, if Elektra was a Skrull and nobody knew, who else is a Skrull and nobody knows. Now, chronologically, in terms of discovering who was a Skrull and who was not, technically Nick Fury was the first one to figure it out because it's always Nick Fury. That's why. Because Nick Fury's always the first one to know, and he's always the first one to go underground, and he's always the first one to form plans. Hence the reason when the world went to pot during Age of Ultron, they found Nick Fury alive in a bunker because he always plans ahead for things that are going on. Now, what Tony Stark does is he takes this information and he goes to the Illuminati, Reed Richards, Hank Pym, these guys. Remember, Charles Xavier's not around at this point. This is after the events of House of M. So Charles Xavier, as far as I'm aware, is still gone. But he goes to them and he says, hey, look, guys, we need to do something about this because, you know, if Elektra was a Skrull, she's not the only one. There's no way she can be the only one. There have to be more, and we have to find a way to ferret them out. Now, what we also do here is we transition to the headquarters of SWORD. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with All New, All Different Marvel or reading All New, All Different Marvel right now, you will know SWORD as the organization that Carol Danvers is heading right now. But back here, back during the events of Secret Invasion, SWORD was being led by a woman named Abigail Brand, and she'll actually be pretty important later on down the line. But SWORD stands for Sentient World Observation and Response Department. It's one of several organizations that exist in Marvel Comics that serve some purpose in relation to Earth, somewhat like S.H.I.E.L.D. S.H.I.E.L.D. is its own self-contained organization. SWORD is its own self-contained organization. Strike, so on and so forth, they're their own organization. Strike is an organization called Special Tactics Response for Key Emergencies or something along those lines, I can't remember. But it's an organization based out of London that's kind of like London's version of S.H.I.E.L.D. to a degree, except on a little bit of a different purpose. In the sense that instead of just monitoring, they actually act on stuff. But the fact remains, each organization has its own purpose. SWORD exists to monitor other worlds across the universe and make sure they don't become a threat to Earth. But this shows you how cloak and dagger the Skrulls were. And the reason for this is because while SWORD is, you know, doing their job, they're showing people what's going on, so on and so forth, we have a, you know, object that comes crashing down onto the Earth in the Savage Land. And while this is being monitored by SWORD, we also have, you know, Hank Pym, Tony Stark, and Reed Richards analyzing the body of Elektra. Now, the reason why they're looking at her body is because, to the best of their knowledge from what they've been able to pick up, the magic of Doctor Strange, the technology of Tony Stark and Reed Richards, the various devices and so on, there was nothing to indicate that Elektra was a Skrull, which means there was no way for them to detect that she was a Skrull. There was no way they could have possibly known. Telepathy wouldn't know, the various magics and so on. She was effectively Elektra to everyone who looked at her. And so because of this, the question they have is there a way to figure out what's going on? Is there a way to learn individuals are Skrulls? And so again, you know, Bendis throws a lot of stuff here, but as we pick up with a Secret Avengers hideout. Now keep in mind, this is post-Civil War. So right now, the Superhuman Registration Act is still in effect. We still have the 50 State Initiative, which we'll get to here in a minute, but you know, Luke Cage, Spider-Man, you know, Hulkling, you know, Wolverine, these are the characters that chose not to register and went underground, avoiding the Superhuman Registration Act at every turn while trying to basically cast off the efforts of Tony Stark and S.H.I.E.L.D. So again, you know, Tony Stark's still the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. A lot of the post-Civil War things are still going on here. But in the midst of all this, of course, they're basically told, hey, look, there was a device that crashed down in the Savage Land. Luke Cage and his team go to investigate, but we also have the Mighty Avengers who go to look at this. Now, the Mighty Avengers was a post-Civil War team that was led, if I remember, by Carol Danvers, and it was kind of like her own Avengers team because she was pro-Tony Stark during Civil War. And the Mighty Avengers was actually carried on for quite some time, and eventually Luke Cage became the leader of the second iteration of the team. But when they all get to the Savage Land, and of course they find this vessel, everybody's investigating. Now, on the surface, or at least almost immediately, it's this idea of, you know, Tony Stark's team versus Luke Cage's team, and they do bicker, they do argue a little bit, there is a little bit of a discussion that goes on, but in the background, back at the SWORD headquarters, we have Dum Dum Dugan, again, a longtime friend of Nick Fury, who's revealed to be a Skrull, and what he does is he sabotages the SWORD satellite and blows it up. Now, there are a multitude of people who die, but some of the more important members like Abigail Brand and the few of the upper staff are basically ejected using some kind of gelatin that basically keeps them confined and gives them some measure of oxygen for a time. But what we also learn is while all this stuff is being watched by Jarvis, you know, by virtue of Tony Stark's suit, Jarvis activates a device that not only takes down Tony Stark's suit, but takes down all these different satellites, everything that Tony Stark has access to. Now, this is really, really important, and this is actually the reason why Tony Stark is ousted as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the end of the story, because the helicarrier Tony Stark can tap into using his technology, the various satellites that orbit Earth, he can tap into the entire defense system of the United States, you know, everything in S.H.I.E.L.D., it all just experiences this massive blackout and comes crashing down. Not only that, this virus that's unleashed by Jarvis effectively renders Tony Stark's suit almost completely inert. And so this is why Tony Stark was effectively ousted, because he, you know, by virtue of his technology, he was a gateway for someone to access his suit and then take everything out. And so because of this, we really run into a major panic situation. Now, somebody else I want to point out here is Norman Osborn, who's currently running the Thunderbolts. Thunderbolt. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to wait and run over the 50-state initiative. Following the events of Civil War, when Tony Stark and when Reed Richards and Hank Pym and those guys were pushing the initiative, the idea was to have a superhero team in all 50 states, which they were largely successful in doing. But in Colorado, we had the Thunderbolts. Now, the Thunderbolts had been a long-time team. I mean, they'd existed for quite some time in Marvel Comics, but during Civil War, they were revamped to the point where they were basically bad guys who were trying to redeem themselves to a degree. So it's kind of like the Suicide Squad from DC Comics. But Norman Osborn's currently running the team, and the idea was to have the Thunderbolts, kind of operate out there in left field, carrying out various missions and so on and so forth to prove that they could have value. Of course, the entire incident here, I guess the entire base, is basically run up on by what seems to be a revived Captain Marvel, who has long since been dead. And so again, all these different attacks are all being launched at the same time. For example, Susan Storm is revealed to be a Skrull. She sneaks away as she's, on this tour of the Fantastic Four's Baxter building, and she basically goes into one of their technological rooms and activates the negative zone. And what it does is it snatches out the entire Baxter building and basically teleports it directly to the negative zone. So again, it's pretty much removed here, and it's sent to where Prison 42 is located. Now, at the conclusion of this introductory event, what we have is inside this vessel that crashes onto the surface of the world are all these different superheroes: Captain America, Jean Grey, Susan Storm, Luke Cage. But something that I want you to notice here is that the characters as they're depicted here are classic characters. More specifically, they are the characters when they were taken and duplicated by the Skrulls. So Luke Cage was taken and duplicated by the Skrulls, when he was initially starting a superhero career as Power Man. Jean Grey was taken by the Skrulls when she was wearing her iconic Phoenix uniform. Wolverine, back during his classic form. This shows you how far back everything goes, how long this plan's been going on when it comes to the Skrulls replacing superheroes. But it's also a way for Bendis to say, hey guys, here's how you differentiate between traditional superheroes and those who were Skrulls, or maybe how you differentiate between Skrulls and the regular superheroes. It's, at this point, he's leaving it to us to guess which one's which. But finally, we basically pick up with Reed Richards continuing to analyze this body of Elektra, or I guess this body of the Skrull Elektra, and he comes to the realization by analyzing her physiology, there's a way to detect the difference between the Skrulls and humans, after which Hank Pym turns on him, shoots him with a molecular destabilizer, and reveals himself to be a Skrull. So what Bendis was really kind of shooting for here was the idea of, we don't know who's a Skrull and who's not a Skrull. It was really this cool story where the question was, who do you trust here? Now at this point, things pick up pretty readily in the sense that we have, all these different heroes fighting each other back in the Savage Land. I mean, it's Spider-Man versus Spider-Man. It's basically these heroes going against their own counterparts or some of the most notable versions of themselves. For example, we have, the Sentry going against Vision, but then Vision, of course, begins to basically draw out or at least mimic this aspect of the Void, which of course sends Robert Reynolds, flying away, sends him running away, so on, because, we know if the Void were to actually emerge, it would lead to probably the death of everybody who was here. The Void would just wipe them all out because his power is limitless. The Void's power is whatever Marvel wants it to be at any particular point in time. That's kind of what his caveat is. But at the same time, we have Carol Danvers effectively taking Tony Stark away. And the reason for this is because Stark's armor needs to be revived in order for it to work. But more so than that, the fact that this virus affected his suit means, he realizes it's affected everything. And so what he says is, I gotta find a way to figure out what's going on with this virus. The entire world's in danger. Carol Danvers, get out of here, go to New York and find out what's going on. Now, the reason why Carol Danvers was chosen is because of the fact that she is extremely powerful in her own right. Really in anybody's right, to be quite frank. She can go toe to toe with the Hulk because of her super strength. She has the ability to absorb and project energy because of her time, or I guess her powers is binary. She has a wide array of abilities at her disposal. And so she's certainly a character you would want in your corner. More so than that, while all the other superheroes were fighting each other, of course the T-Rex came running through because it's a savage land and dinosaurs are there, but it created a really dangerous situation. And the reason why is because as long as they were fighting in one location, it was easy to know who was who, or at the very least, which version of the characters you were coming across. But now, when they're all kind of scattered everywhere, you don't know if the person you're running into is a Skrull or if the person you're running into is an actual superhero. Now, the cool thing about this is that Natasha Romanoff is going to find a very simple solution to solve this problem. Of course, that comes later. But again, they're really just trying to get things sorted out. They're trying to get things figured out. But then suddenly we come across the arrival of Bobby Morse. Now, Bobby Morse had been dead for quite some time. Mockingbird had been gone from the equation, but her arrival here, as far as Clint Barton goes, is really more of a desire than listening to reason, because Barton's like, well, if she's alive, then that's awesome. I mean, she's here, that's great, and he's not really willing to listen to reason here. He says he is, but he's not, because in truth, the love of his life has come back to life. It would be like if Spider-Man saw Gwen Stacy alive once again. Sure, he might listen to reason to a degree, but in truth, he would be like, that's Gwen Stacy, she's alive, oh my God, and his irrationality would basically take over. His heart would start running the show. But again, back in New York, we effectively have the arrival of all these different Skrulls who have powers of superheroes. And that was really the main emphasis, although there are a few that they either had to double up on or they had to simply just kind of copy to a degree, especially when it comes to Wolverine. Remember, Wolverine's got true adamantium, and the Skrulls couldn't really duplicate true adamantium. They could to a degree, but it's very difficult to do. And so we effectively have, all these Skrulls showing up, some of whom have combined powers, where one has a power of Colossus skin and, these makeshift claws of Wolverine, as well as Cyclops' optic blast. We have some that have the powers of the Fantastic Four. There's a lot of different versions here that are all showing up, but this is ultimately the goal of the Skrulls, is to basically invade the Earth using the abilities of characters that they've essentially duplicated over the course of having these characters imprisoned. And so it's a double-edged, not really a double-edged sword, it's a dual effort invasion. On one half, you create distrust among all the superheroes by throwing in those who might be Skrulls or might not be Skrulls. And that's one of the big efforts here, because the idea is that, the superheroes don't know who to trust. So they're already fragmented because of Civil War. They're fragmented even further because of the fact they don't know if the person they're talking to is actually Luke Cage or is a Skrull. But then we also have all these Skrulls showing up on Earth with powers. So it creates a really dangerous situation. But then again, from here, we basically have Tony Stark, continuing to work on his project. And then suddenly he's met by the arrival of Jessica Drew. And this is when we basically learn that Jessica Drew is actually Queen of the Skrulls, that she is a Skrull, and she actually tries to convince Tony Stark that he's a Skrull. Now, this is the crazy thing, because the poison, or I guess the virus that Tony Stark experienced, is as much biological as it is technological. And so while I wouldn't say it puts him in a state of mind control, it does put him in a state where he can be, manipulated to a degree. The thing to keep in mind here is that Tony Stark's intelligence is extremely high. So it's not like just, exposing any random person to this virus, because if they had, they'd be easily manipulatable. But with Tony Stark, he can't be manipulated that well because his intelligence is just so high. But again, back in New York, it's just this continued battle, with all these different superheroes being completely obliterated by all these different members of the Skrulls. But in the middle of this conflict, we basically have this explosion that emerges from the ground, and we come across Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos. Now again, Nick Fury had been aware of this Skrull invasion for quite some time and had been working to try to gather, really try to figure out who it was that he could trust. Because you keep in mind, for Nick Fury's character, Nick Fury doesn't really trust anybody. The other half of this is that, for those of you guys who saw Original Sin, this is a life model decoy Nick Fury. It's not the real Nick Fury. So because of this, Nick Fury never looks at anybody and says, I can inherently trust that person. For him, it's only ever really a temporary thing. Now, again, at this point, moving away from Nick Fury's arrival with Daisy Johnson and all these guys, we basically have, Reed Richards, who's continuing to be experimented on by the Skrulls themselves. Now, the reason why they're experimenting on him is, part way to understand exactly how his physiology works, but the other half is to remove him from the equation. Because remember, right now, Reed Richards is probably the most intelligent person in the Marvel Universe, especially because we're coming up on the events of Hickman's Fantastic Four. Keep in mind that in our discussions about the Incredible Hulk, the intelligentsia have already affected the mind of Dr. Doom, and so he's not as smart as he used to be. And so with Reed Richards being the guy at the very, very top, being able to figure out who the Skrulls are extremely dangerous, because all he has to do is create a device, and suddenly the enemy is easy to spot as opposed to being virtually invisible. And so again, we get this really, really cool monologue from the Skrull Queen as we kind of, jump over these different conflicts in New York, the conflicts in the Savage Land, the superheroes not knowing who to trust, all that kind of good stuff. And what she's doing is really talking to Tony Stark. And while we have Natasha Romanoff listening to all this unfold, now the Skrull Queen's basically saying, the reason why we're going to win this war is because you can't trust each other. In order to win a war like this, you have to know who's your friend and who's an enemy. You don't even know who your friends are here. Not only that, you're Tony Stark. You're the most hated person on the face of the planet. But she says, all of this was by design because you were put here. You, Tony Stark, are a Skrull. You were put here for the purpose of seeding distrust among the superhero community during the events of Civil War. You were put here to become the most powerful man in the world, which you succeeded in doing after you became director of S.H.I.E.L.D. when Civil War was over. You've basically achieved the goal as we set it out to be. You are effectively the most dangerous person here, and you're the reason why we were able to pull this off. Now, of course, with this conversation being overheard by Natasha Romanoff, Natasha Romanoff is, the reason why she's one of the most badass comic book characters is because she will deal with things quick, fast, and in a hurry. And that's why I love her so much, because she shoots first and asks questions later. And that's what she says. She's like, look, we can do this dance all day long. I mean, of course, you're tasting off Jessica Drew. She's talking to Tony Stark and is like, hey, look, you're not a Skrull, man, but you got to get on your feet and we got to get something going here, because either you can sit around and ponder whether you're a Skrull or not, or we can get it in gear and we can get this problem solved. And so she says, what I'm doing right now is I'm not hem-hawing around. I'm not trying to figure out who's a Skrull and who's not. She's like, anybody that I see, I'm shooting them on sight. If their blood turns green and they turn into a Skrull and they die, we know they were a Skrull. If their blood comes out red and they start yelling at me, we know they were probably a human. So I think we're good on that. And that's exactly what she does. When Wolverine shows up, she shoots him, says, hey, I was just checking to make sure that you weren't a Skrull. The same thing with anybody else who comes across her path. So she says that to everybody out there. She says, if you see anyone, shoot them on sight, ask questions later. We'll heal those or do whatever it is we need to do in order to make sure that they can recover. But again, the cool thing about this, one of the other cool things too, is we have Abigail Brand. Now remember, Abigail Brand is one of the members of SWORD, or I guess the leader of SWORD, but the reason why she was always so cool, and one of the reasons why she's so important here, is because her ability, I guess the design of her tongue, basically allows her to speak any alien language. And so when she effectively sneaks aboard the Skrull ship after kind of floating out into space in this weird gelatinous stuff after the SWORD ship blew up, she begins going through and basically asking questions, trying to infiltrate this Skrull ship. And when that happens, she's able to really take them by surprise and begin the process of trying to free Reed Richards. Now, back on Earth, this is really when the battle begins to change. This is when the tide begins to shift, because while these Skrulls are wreaking havoc, on superheroes and attacking humans at the same time, we're suddenly met with the arrival of Thor. Now, this is something that I've kind of been holding off to kind of run over here. With regards to the arrival of Thor, this story comes after Ragnarok and after J. Michael Straczynski's Thor Volume 1. So Thor has already come back after the events of Ragnarok. He already had that massive fight with Tony Stark where he basically said, I don't trust you, I don't want to have anything to do with you. I will fight if the Earth needs me, but if it doesn't, do not come knocking on my door because I'm going to smash your face in if you do. And so again, it creates kind of a cool thing, but we basically have Nick Fury and his various heroes bailing out of New York. I mean, they're like, hey, we got to get out of here. Sure, some civilians are going to die, but we have to get out, we have to regroup, we have to figure out what's going on, we have to have a better understanding, we have to know who's on our side and who's against us. So again, this creates an opportunity for the Skrulls to begin broadcasting on these satellites that they commandeer through Tony Stark's technology and start telling the world, hey, we're here to make your life better. We're here to offer you a kind of, wholeness that you've never experienced before because your superheroes have basically destroyed your world. We're here to make it a better place. It's effectively the Skrulls saying, we're taking over your world. Either you can accept it, either the change can be easy or the change can be hard. And if the change is hard, then it's probably going to result in your death. So again, picking up with Abigail Brand with regards to her releasing Reed Richards, what she says is, hey, look, I know it seems like a Skrull, but I'm not a Skrull. I'm on your side. We got to get you out of here. We got to find some way to take these Skrulls out. Now, again, Reed Richards was in the middle of figuring out how to detect the difference between a Skrull and a regular person. And he says, we've got to get back to that. We've got to be able to figure out who these Skrulls are. And so working alongside Abigail Brand, he begins the process of getting his weapon reassembled, getting it back together. But where he initially says, we have to find a way to basically reach my family, figure out where they are, find a way to get them back. She says, no, we need to go to New York. We have to go and grab the rest of the superheroes because yes, your family is important, but we need to find a way to figure out who's a Skrull and who's not. And we need to be able to eliminate the Skrull threat by gathering all the superheroes together, because if we don't, not only is your family going to die, the world is going to die. So in this instance, the world's more important than your family, and that's just how it is. And so because of that, she basically whisks him away and brings him back to the Savage Land, back to Earth. And so what this does is this sort of culminates in a lot of these superheroes who initially appeared in the Savage Land, coming back and meeting one another yet again. Because remember, they've just kind of been scattered around the whole time. So they're sort of reuniting, and it's continuing to instill a lot of distrust. But, with their arrival also comes the arrival of Reed Richards, and he basically fires off a weapon and reveals to all of them who's Skrulls and who's not. So in the immediate vicinity, it's easy to eliminate people. And what we learn is that Bobby Morse was very much a Skrull. And so because of this, Clint Barton is effectively forced to kill the woman of his dreams, which does have somewhat of a psychological effect. But then he turns around and he says, he goes through and kills every last one. And he says, guys, no matter what happens, no matter how this ends, we're killing every single Skrull. Because for Clint Barton, it's personal. They duplicated the love of his life, a woman that he's known for years and years and years. For him, it's like, that's not okay. That's a problem. And so what they do is they basically use the technology of Reed Richards and begin traveling around, tracking down everyone they can find, and basically, killing them off, in addition to finally taking this battle directly to New York City itself. Now, because they have this technology at their disposal, it's really just kind of like this all hands on deck. I mean, it's Nick Fury and his Secret Warriors, it's the Young Avengers, it's the Avengers with, alongside Thor. I mean, it's really everybody who goes in here and just starts attacking every single person that they come across. More so than that, the battle is quite fierce in the sense that people seem to have this idea that it may end up resulting in the destruction of New York itself. The 50-state initiative, all the members of the initiative are here. The Thunderbolts are here. The Avengers are here. What's left of the X-Men are here. Those superheroes who are not on any team are here. I mean, there's even like a Skrull Galactus that's here. I mean, it's insane, what kind of people that we have fighting in this massive conflict. But in the midst of all this, Marvel effectively kills off Janet Van Dyne, because keep in mind, Marvel doesn't really do like hard reboots reboots. Marvel does soft reboots where they'll launch events and they'll just clear out a whole bunch of stuff with a single event. Janet Van Dyne had kind of been this character that had been lingering around. She was considered to be old hat. After Avengers disassembled, she was just kind of there. You know, during the events of Civil War, she was just kind of there. And so Marvel was like, okay, let's either, let's keep her or let's kill her. And because nobody could really figure out anything, reasonable to do with her, they said, let's kill her off. And then let's just give Hank Pym another crisis of conscience. And he would actually become Wasp after this. But what ends up happening is Hawkeye more or less just goes on a rampage. And while he's killing off, all these different Skrulls with explosive tip arrows, he actually manages to penetrate the mouth of the Skrull Queen. Now, because of the fact that she's presumed to be dead, what ends up happening is one of the Skrull duplicates basically activates a particular button. Now, we didn't really know what this button did before, but what we learned is that this Skrull Hank Pym, prior to the events of Secret Invasion, had basically given Janet Van Dyne a new growth formula, a new giant woman formula that she could use in case of an emergency if there was some major conflict and they needed two giant people running around. But what was revealed is that this formula was actually basically would turn Janet Van Dyne into a bomb, like into a biological bomb. And so instead of, growing in size, while she would do that, she would just begin to let off massive amounts of energy to the point that she would detonate and quite literally kill everyone. And so for those of you guys who saw my video on the Incredible Hulk killing, all the heroes in the Marvel Universe, that's basically where that was drawing from, is it was drawing off this idea that she was essentially a giant bomb that was just waiting to be activated. Now, of course, Thor steps in and Thor is able to use his powers to whisk her away. But because of the fact that the actions of the Skrulls, resulted in the death of Janet Van Dyne, in their mind, it was the death of one of their own. Not only that, Janet Van Dyne was a founding member of the Avengers. She was the one that thought of the name. And so because of that, she's been around for so long, been such an intricate part of the team. It's not like a civilian died. It's not like a regular person died. Poor member of the Avengers family died. And in response, humanity loses it. Now, this is where everything changes, because while the Avengers, especially Wolverine, prepares to basically kill the Queen of the Skrulls, Norman Osborn steps in front of the cameras and is the one that ends up killing the Skrull Queen. And so despite the fact that all the superheroes were fighting, despite the fact that they were doing everything they could, and the rest of the superheroes ended up flying out into space and destroying what was left of the Skrull Armada, in the eyes of everyone who was watching this event unfold, Norman Osborn saved the day. And so because of that, what ends up happening as this story begins to wrap up, Tony Stark is basically ousted as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. under the idea that his technology tying into the US defense system and S.H.I.E.L.D. itself was the way in which the Skrulls were able to take down the United States almost in its entirety, that because of what was perceived to be his incompetence, that he was no longer fit to run S.H.I.E.L.D. And so in his place, Norman Osborn, as the savior of the world more or less, replaces Tony Stark, and he ends up becoming the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, what this did, because of the fact that this was designed to reshuffle things, what this did is it allowed Marvel to basically go forward with an event called Dark Reign. And it basically started, it wasn't really like a huge crossover event in the sense like Secret Invasion. It was more or less like an event that was composed of just a series of smaller events, a series of small stories, Dark Avengers, Dark X-Men, stuff like that. But it also allowed Marvel to eventually transition into the heroic age around 2010, 2011. It was kind of a cool transition. But again, that's really what this is it's really just Marvel setting the stage, creating a new status quo. And what we have is Norman Osborn basically going to what is perceived to be his own cabal, with the newly reformed Loki as a woman, with Emma Frost, Doctor Doom, Name of the Submariner, with the Hood, and essentially saying, now that I'm in charge, now that I'm director of S.H.I.E.L.D., we're basically going to use my power to essentially take over the United States and eventually the world. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like. I kind of like going back and doing a lot of this older stuff because it fills in this Marvel, like this major event chronology. I'm gonna make a playlist out of that where it's just like the chronology of major events from Marvel Comics, because we've got Annihilation, we've got Civil War, we have, now we have Secret Invasion. We'll probably do Dark Reign. The great thing about Dark Reign is that because it's a bunch of mini stories, like those can just be covered a lot more in depth than Secret Invasion, because Secret Invasion was like 100 issues long if you take all the tie-ins into account, and there's just not enough time to do all that stuff. But we may come back later on and fill those in, as time progresses, add in the tie-ins here and there. I don't know how popular this will be, and I don't even know if anybody cares about those tie-ins or not, but let me know down in the comment section. I'm kind of curious. I'm sure like the super hardcore fans will be like, yes, I want to see all the tie-ins, even if only like 30 people watch them, I want to see them. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing. I can't laugh because I got bronchitis. God, it's rough. Anyway, guys, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and bounce out here. I'm gonna stop rambling, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
I'm ready to fly before we collapse.